Today we have with us Ghina Al Andary. She works for KAFA, which is an association that we have partnered with in the past. I will tell you some details about this later on. But first, I just wanted to explain the framework in which we are working on today. As you know, in Europe, it's Mother's Day in the next weekend on the 8th. And we as European Network of Migrant Women, we're participating in a project that is called Moms at Work. And it's a project that aims at the social and professional integration of migrant mothers in Europe. So I invited Ghina for this Migrant Women Reality Watch because we wanted to hear more about the migrant mothers that KAFA deals with. And this is why she is here with us today. Just to give you some little background before we start, we are welcoming Ghina. So she is a case and outreach worker at KAFA in violence and exploitation. So this organization is a Lebanese civil and nonprofit feminist and secular organization that more generally seeks to create a society that is free of social, economic, and legal patriarchal structures. But more specifically, KAFA holds an anti-trafficking and exploitation unit that addresses two forms of exploitation that really specifically target women, which is sexual exploitation and trafficking and forced domestic work. So today we will be talking more about the women that go to KAFA to, you know, in the background of the domestic work system or program that they have. But we will also be talking about women in prostitution and more generally about the migrant mothers that come to KAFA, the migrant women who are migrant domestic workers, the migrant mothers who are, you know, trapped in the system of prostitution, and how is their life in Lebanon. So thank you so much, Ghina. Thank you so much for the patience with the internet connections, and welcome to Migrant Women Reality Watch.
Thank you, Adriana. I'm really happy to be talking to you and to the network, and thank you for bearing with me the connection and electricity problem. I think we're set now and it should all be fine.
Yes.
So yeah, I'm really happy to be talking to you about migrant women, migrant domestic workers, and the reality of these women, as well as the women who are trapped in the prostitution system in Lebanon.
Thank you. I hear you perfectly, so I think it should be okay. Once again, to the audience, I plead some patience in case things go wrong. We're doing the best that we can. So yes, without further ado, Ghina, if you could maybe present yourself and KAFA. I know I said some words here, but I believe it's best when the women who we invite present themselves. So yeah, for our audience, if you could present yourself, your interests, what do you do in Lebanon, and then what is KAFA, what is the work that you women do, and yes, thank you.
Thank you. You did a great job presenting me and KAFA, but to give some more information, I'm a social worker, specifically a case and outreach worker. I've been working with KAFA for almost 5 years now, specifically under the Anti-Trafficking Unit with focus on the Migrant Domestic Workers program. As KAFA, like you mentioned, we're a feminist, secular, non-governmental organization. KAFA in Arabic means enough, so it's enough violence and exploitation, and it's an organization that works towards the elimination of violence against women and girls. We have different units under which we work. So we have a family violence unit, and it's support center. It's the section that provides services. We have a child protection unit, and the unit I work at, which is the Anti-Trafficking Unit. The Anti-Trafficking Unit has two programs. So there's a Migrant Domestic Workers program and a Women in Prostitution program. We work on different levels. So we have a multi-layered approach. We do advocacy work. We do awareness raising on both issues. We do capacity building, so we might train police forces or immigration authorities, as well as different service providers on the two topics. We also, and of course, with the population that we work with, so we do capacity building trainings with the domestic workers or women in prostitution themselves. And in terms of direct services, we operate a 24/7 helpline, which receives calls from both populations. We do provide services for women migrant domestic workers who are victims of physical and or sexual abuse by their employers or their agents, or who are trafficked into forced labor. We have a shelter that receives these women, and we have a holistic model for our service provision. So we provide these women with psychological, social, legal, medical services within our shelter. The same applies for the women in prostitution. We do not have a criteria to assist women in prostitution, so any woman can receive assistance from us. That covers it, I think, for what we do. And yeah, with my work specifically, I work in assisting women migrant domestic workers receiving the helpline calls. I accompany them through investigations, as well as other activities. Sometimes I contribute to trainings and such activities.
That's a pretty complete description, and I think it really shows how massive the work at KAFA is, right? There's a lot of specificities, and then there's a lot of services that you provide, and you also focus both on the grassroots and the institutional. So yeah, congratulations to you women and to Ghada, the founder, for setting up such a good organization.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that KAFA works with these two, let's say, target publics. Like, you have both women in prostitution, and then you have the migrant domestic workers. Why not focus solely on one thing? And I wanted to understand, or for our audience to understand, if there's an intersection between the two. Why did you choose these two publics and not just focus on migrant domestic workers or women in prostitution?
So KAFA was founded in 2005. In 2010, we founded our Anti-Trafficking Unit, and the two programs were operating at the same time. So the program for women in prostitution and for domestic workers. The approach is trafficking, and trafficking in women specifically. We know that in prostitution, around 80% of the persons trafficked into prostitution are women and girls. In domestic work, we know that domestic women are overrepresented in paid domestic work, and these two kinds of trafficking target women specifically. We started working on the issue of domestic work as a violence against women. We approach it from a feminist lens, not just as a work issue. We know that migrant workers suffer abuses or violations at the hands of their employers. However, migrant domestic workers face a specific kind of abuse under the kafala system or the sponsorship that is specific to women because they are women. And everyone knows that prostitution is a misogynist system that targets women. So yeah, we approach it from the lens of trafficking that targets women and a specific form of violence that targets women. Now, the two populations might be separate, or the kind of struggles that they face might be separate. However, there are lots of intersections. So, for example, when we talk about prostitution, we talk about the last girl, who is usually the most marginalized, most of the times a migrant woman, someone who's undocumented, someone who's poor, from who did not receive education, from war zones or from areas of conflict. So these are some of the characteristics of the women in prostitution. We don't have the same term, for example, for domestic workers, but they come from similar backgrounds. So they are, in Lebanon, they are recruited from African countries and Southeast Asian countries, such as like Sri Lanka, Nepal, Philippines. They also come from similar backgrounds. Usually they come from remote areas of their countries of origin, not from the city. They are, like I said, from poor areas. They did not receive education, sometimes even underage. So they get mostly their families or their agents would forge their passports and send them to Lebanon. So these are some common characteristics of these two populations. What we are seeing now is an increased intersection between the two populations, because over the past 2 years, the crises that hit Lebanon, starting with the pandemic, and then the economic crisis and the port blast and all these things left domestic workers stranded. I'm sure you're familiar with the in 2020, when domestic workers were in the streets, they were evicted or they were stranded by their employers, or they had to leave because of abusive employment relationships. These women, they went out and they had nowhere to go. So they were very easily targeted by the prostitution system. And this is the link that we are seeing right now. There is still no evidence or data to back that up. But we know this from our interaction with the domestic workers and from the reports that we receive, that this is an increased phenomenon. And it is only normal because the prostitution system clearly targets vulnerable women. And these women could not be more vulnerable. They were already trapped in a slavery-like system when they were still at their employer's house, denied or isolated from the rest of the world, overworked, not paid, suffering physical and sexual abuse at times. And when they exited these employments, they had nowhere to go. They left mid-pandemic, so they were not able to find part-time jobs as they used to outside their employers' houses. And they were left to starve or left stranded. Also, the ones who had been living outside for a while, they were evicted. They were not able to secure food or things like that. So the same result, they were targeted by the prostitution system. And I think this is an increased link right now. Before, refugee women were overrepresented in prostitution, again, because who is the most vulnerable and who is the most easily exploited in this situation is this profile of a woman.
Thank you. It's very understandable what you said, and it really makes sense if you're, in tune with, or if you know a bit about the prostitution system. And it's very clear how they intersect. It just comes to my mind, like I wish that so many, organizations that deal with purely labor, but then address trafficking, they would have the same analysis that KAFA has, because I believe it's very, very special, and it should be harmonized in the world. So again, congratulations for the work that you do. I wanted to ask you, because some years ago, actually, KAFA was the organization that led the first ever report on women in prostitution in Lebanon, right?
We had conducted several studies in Lebanon. We specifically a few years back, we conducted a study with sex buyers on their motives. If that's the study you're referring to. In 2020, we released another report on, it's called Exit, on what women in prostitution need to exit prostitution, which is interesting because among the factors that they reported that they need to exit prostitution is, for example, or is a priority, shelter and food, and but shelter comes first. So shelter and work, and domestic workers who entered the prostitution system at this point have lost both. So you see how it's all connected.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, if you allow me this question, how was it received by Lebanese society? You know, because as I understand, or maybe Lebanon is a bit more free in that sense, but if you are having extramarital relationships, you are already considered more or less that you are doing prostitution. So how could you really work with that in society to, you know, to explain that it's two different things?
Actually, this brings me to a step back. So domestic workers before the crisis at Lebanon are usually, so like we said, they're African and Asian women. There's already this kind of racism or stereotypes towards these women. They are hypersexualized or perceived as such. And whenever we addressed the breaches of the sponsorship system or the kafala system and the violations that the employers commit, such as you cannot withhold her passport, you cannot confiscate her identity documents, you cannot look her up inside, she has a day off, she has the right to go out. The counter argument from the Lebanese employers would be that, do you want me to let her go out so she could come back pregnant, or do you want me to let her to go out so she'd be involved in prostitution? So these were already perceptions that these women are going to engage in prostitution if they were if their rights were not violated and they were able to go out. And of course, the perception of their involvement in prostitution does not come from an analysis of vulnerability or understanding of their vulnerability. It's out of judgment or demoralizing these women. So they're definitely immoral, and they're going to be engaging in prostitution if they were to get out. So you can imagine the ideas that they had against domestic workers before this increased intersection starts appearing. And even before, domestic workers were engaged in prostitution when they were living out or when they left their employers' houses, but not with the same rate. When it comes to prostitution in general, we have very judgmental attitudes towards these women. Lebanon criminalizes the woman involved in prostitution and her pimp the same way. So they are both imprisoned for the same period of time. There are conflicting laws. So it's really not easy to address these issues, because no one sees the women in this system as someone who's being exploited, but rather as someone who's immoral. Sometimes there is an understanding of the exploitation, but often there is a judgment on the woman. No one, of course, brings into the discussion the sex buyers. So yeah, this is how the issue is unfortunately handled or approached by the majority.
Okay, and just to take us another step back, because you mentioned several times the kafala system or the sponsorship system, if you could explain it in general terms to our audience, so we know exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah, so the sponsorship system, or as we say in Arabic, kafala system, is a recruitment system that exists in Lebanon and some of the Gulf countries. We specifically use the term system and not law or not policy because it is a system. It does not exist in writing. There is no specific policy that is called a kafala policy. It's a mixture of things. So to start with the basics, in Lebanon, domestic workers are explicitly excluded from the labor law under Article 7. So this article excludes domestic workers and farmers from the law. This could, of course, go back to the feudal system and why these populations are excluded from the labor law. But so they are excluded from the labor law. And women are recruited, or migrant women are recruited to Lebanon as domestic workers under certain regulations. So there is no separate law that regulates domestic work or regulates recruitment of migrant women into domestic work. There are few measures or procedures that are imposed by the Ministry of Labor and the General Security. The General Security is the immigration authority in Lebanon because they are migrants. And of course, there is the customary practices. So this is what constitute the kafala system. What we mean by customary practices, things that people do that they are not written anywhere, that they are violating of the rights of domestic workers, such as confiscating the passport, keeping her, locking her inside, and behaviors like that. But when it comes to certain measures, or specifically what defines this kafala system, it's called kafala because you need a kafil, you need a sponsor to be able to come to the country and work as a domestic worker. And you acquire, as a domestic worker, your residency as a result of working for this individual employer. So the name of the individual employer would be on your residency permit as the sponsor of your presence in Lebanon. And this gives too many privileges and a huge control for the Lebanese employer over the life of the domestic worker. So for example, as a domestic worker, because of this system, you are not able to quit your job and go search or apply for another job without your sponsor's approval. So this clearly sets an imbalance in the power and gives the employer total control over the life of this worker. She cannot leave her job or find a different job without the permission of this employer. If she is to exit or to resign her job, she would lose the validity of her residency because you stop working for this person, you no longer have valid residency. You acquire it as a result of your employment for this individual. If you're not working for them anymore, then you don't have a residency permit anymore. And like I said, if she wants to move to a different job, she needs a written permission, a written waiver from the first sponsor to a second sponsor, which really shows how the system allows trafficking to happen and how it is a modern day slavery system, because someone is giving a waiver to another person, a Lebanese person is making a waiver to another Lebanese person, so she could go work there. If the sponsor does not give that waiver, she has no option but going back home. So this is an example of how the system operates and how it traps the domestic worker. So that's why she's trapped. If the domestic worker is in Lebanon and she quits her job, and then she goes by to live her life and find part-time jobs and live her life in Lebanon, she would be violating the residency laws because she is not allowed to live in Lebanon without a valid residency permit. She cannot acquire it without having a sponsor. And this group is the group that we call live-out domestic workers or undocumented domestic workers. They live out in apartments with each other. They might be living with partners. They have part-time jobs or freelance work, but this is irregular or illegal under this system. So you might be living, so the domestic worker would be living in irregularity if she follows this. So again, trapped with the system, jeopardizing detention and deportation. Yeah, and this is the link with human trafficking as well, why we approach it from a trafficking lens, why we say that this system enables human trafficking, because at so many levels. If the domestic worker does not want to go back to her country and does not want to live in irregularity or as a live-out domestic worker, she is trapped with her employer. She is in a forced labor relationship because she is forced to do the work that she doesn't want to do. Of course, other factors come into play, which also enable and enhance, not enhance, enable human trafficking, because it starts with the recruitment of these women as well. So under the system, you do not need to do anything as a Lebanese employer to hire a domestic worker. You just go to a recruitment agency. You look at pictures of women. You say, okay, I want this one. They will tell you that, okay, she speaks English, or she's 25 years old. She might not be 25 years old. She might be 16 and her passport is forced, but regardless. And that's, you say, okay, I will recruit her, and that's it. The recruitment agency in Lebanon handles whatever needs to be handled. And in the country of origin, there's another recruitment agency that also arranges for the recruitment of the domestic worker. The domestic worker is not told anything. The woman is not told anything about her job here in Lebanon. At times, even lied to. She would be told that she's going to be a nurse. She comes to find she's working as a domestic worker, or some information might be intentionally left out, such as how much working hours, how many members of the family, what kind of tasks exactly she needs to do. So you see that deception is already there, and the woman might be very much so trafficked into Lebanon. At times smuggled into different countries, because countries now have ban on Lebanon because of all the violations. So it could start with the country of origin, the trafficking of these women into Lebanon, or it could happen in Lebanon because she is forced into domestic work because she has no other option. Just one more thing, the only document that regulates or that somehow regulates the employment of a domestic worker is a standard unified contract in Lebanon. It is signed in Arabic. It's not translated. This contract stipulates that a domestic worker is able to leave her job or is able to quit her job under three conditions. She has to be either physically or sexually abused by the employer or a family member, and she has to submit proof such as a forensic report or a police report or such reports. She has to prove that she did not get paid for more than 3 months, and she has to, or that she was employed for a different purpose than being a domestic worker. So she's employed, let's say, in a supermarket or something like that. So only these three conditions allow her to quit her job. And otherwise, if she's past the probation period, she's not able to quit the job. Even when one of these conditions are met, like I told you, she has no choice. If the employer does not approve that she changes employment, she has to go back. So it's the system is designed to trap this woman once she arrives, once she's been recruited in her country of origin.
And is this system in place for a very long time? How come it came to life? What was I mean, of course, the main idea is to trap women, but like from legal, which is not very legal because it's not written in law either. But what is the thought process behind? Like how was this system sold to society in a way?
Okay, so it started coming into existence, if you wish, mainly after the Civil War or during the Civil War and past the Civil War period. Before that, the women who worked as domestic workers were orphan girls who were taken by rich families and raised in these families to do the housework, refugee women, Bedouin women, this kind of profile, Syrian and Egyptian women who were in the country. So this was the profile of the women who did domestic work in Lebanon. And when the civil war broke out, many of the sectarian tensions came into play. So a Christian family would not continue to hire a Muslim domestic worker, for example. And that's why the recruitment from abroad started happening. So domestic workers from other countries were being recruited into Lebanon. The kafala system is also a recent term, recent in terminology. Like it's not as old. Like we recently came to naming it as such and calling it a system, because, like I told you, it's not anywhere. But it's not. So the Lebanese government, as with everything else, is withdrawn from the regulating or from doing its job. So to call it that, it's withdrawn. It's left to private sectors to arrange things. So with this mass recruitment, women were not recruited, like it did not happen over the time. There was mass recruitment of domestic workers. And before the economic crisis, it was anyone could afford to hire a domestic worker. You just have to pay her, like you pay one large sum at the beginning of recruitment, and then you pay her $150 or $200 per month. And that was affordable. And what these women provided to the Lebanese families is what the Lebanese country failed to do through its institutions. So childcare, elderly care, other kinds of provisions, such as being present all the time, so both partners could have their life. Both partners could go out or go out and work. So this was kind of a bribe to the Lebanese people, or Lebanese people benefited a lot from this system, because for $200 a month, you have one person who's available on 24/7 basis to do anything and everything you ask for, without any kind of monitoring, any kind of follow-up, or any kind of measures against the employer. No one will ask you, or no one will monitor if the Lebanese employer is paying at the end of each month. And the domestic worker, like we said, it's a system that is designed to trap her. So if she is isolated all the time, she does not speak the language often, where will she go when she's not paid? Who will she complain to? Or if she's beaten, or if she's sexually assaulted? So it's a system that benefits Lebanese people, even if they are not individually abusive. It's a system that favors one party over the other. So of course it's going to benefit the Lebanese employers.
Mm-hmm. And just to go back to what you were saying before, is there must be then, I imagine, a high rate of migrant domestic workers who are sexually abused, who are really unable to prove that they were raped or trafficked or anything of the sort, because of what you just mentioned, the lack of language notions, the lack of knowledge about the institutions. Sometimes they don't even know where they are, I imagine, because they are transferred from point A to point B and isolated. So how does KAFA work around that to bring justice to these women, if you can, of course?
Yeah, no, of course. This is the main scope of our work. Sometimes the woman does not even know the name of people she worked for. So she'd be living with a family for 2 years or 3 years or such, without knowing the name of her rapist, for example, who is the employer, because she is asked to call them Mr. and Madam, so she wouldn't know their names. If she's locked inside, she doesn't know the area where she's at. So many times we try to track the location, so we could go to the police and file a report with the woman. So we try to ask her, try to remember the area, what was next to you. She'd say, we were in the mountains. Not even like any clue of where she was in that area. Because she was isolated, or sometimes when she arrives to us, or when we receive a report about her, for example, the rape might have happened 2 weeks ago, so it's not possible to prove it through any medical or forensic report at this point. The element of proof is very problematic, because many times she's beaten or she's been abused and still trapped in the same house. When she leaves that house and reaches us, it's hard to go to the police because there is no kind of proof. We have to go to the police when the assault had happened within the 24 hours. So that's why it's hard for these women to access justice, and it's not an easy system to navigate. Many women are turned away by the police. Many migrant women are turned away by the police when they reach them, because the police either do not want to handle these cases, or we hear it sometimes from police officers that this should be the immigration's responsibility, although a crime has been committed against the woman, so they don't do their job. It's a mess, and it's almost impossible for these women to win at anything. So we have a legal team, or we assist women legally, of course, throughout the process, whether we need to obtain any kind of supporting documentation or to go to the police. She doesn't go alone, we accompany her through the investigation. Sometimes we might go through a different channel, so we might approach the case as a civil case, go to the labor tribunal if it's an issue of wages and such. We might go through the immigration. We have different approaches. And then the issue is that these are very bureaucratic and lengthy procedures. So the woman might end up giving up or relinquishing her rights just to go back home because she's too tired waiting, too tired expecting anything. None of the cases we helped women filed like end up like for the verdict to be issued. It might take up to 5 years at least if it's not appealed and such. So the woman would be back in her home. It's a lost case. You see, it's the woman never win at this with the system. So yeah, it's really depressive and it's really unfair for the women.
Yeah, it's got so many intersections with prostitution and even surrogacy and other kinds of violence that we can think of. I mean, it's yeah. If it weren't for the suffering of women, it would be almost interesting. But in the sense, it's, as you say, it's depressive, and it must be very hard to work under those situations, because even though you do, you know, there is a system to file a complaint, things like that, it can be very frustrating for you also as an organization, you know, to not be able to provide that concrete hope for women. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, just to say, like, it's lost justice. Like I said, she can never win, and that's what matters most, because if the perpetrator is not being punished for his or her crimes as employers, the system continues to regenerate itself, and new victims will fall into the system. So it's just a loop.
Wow, I have so many questions, but you were mentioning mothers before, which is also kind of the focus today. You said that under the sponsorship program, obviously women could not have children with them, because I assume that employers are not ready to host children in their private houses. What happens with women, for example, if they get unwanted pregnancies out of sexual abuse that occurs from the part of the employer? What really happens to these women?
So there are so many so many layers to this. So under the this system, like you said, domestic workers are not so they cannot have their families here in Lebanon. If she has a child, she cannot bring that child with her or have a child here and register the child. This is because of the categories that are specified by the immigration authorities. So there are like 4 categories for migrants. Domestic workers are under the 4th category. So they are not allowed to have children. And of course, if she already comes pregnant from her country of origin, the employer, like you said, is not willing to have her and the child. And within the first 3 months, it's the responsibility of the agent to repatriate her back home if she wants to go home because of her pregnancy. But most often, because, so this is if there is no sexual abuse. I'm just starting with this kind of example. Most often because the recruitment agencies have been paid by the employers, they don't want to lose that money because this is not a human being, this is not a woman, this is a trade object, and they want to benefit the maximum out of this situation, so they force her to abort the child. Given that in Lebanon abortion is illegal, however, it doesn't matter when she's a migrant woman because it's the agent or the Lebanese employer asking for this abortion. It's a man that is asking for this abortion, and this woman is not seen as a human being with equal rights. So forced abortions pass by like normally, and no one would be held accountable for this or anything of that sort. So this is one situation. As you mentioned, many times the woman is or becomes pregnant as a result of the sexual abuse. Often the employer and the agent are complicit again in forced abortions, or she is kicked out by the employers, stranded in the street to face it on her own. This is what usually happens, or repatriated back home quickly, if not paid her wages, without her wages, to cover up the sexual abuse that happened and resulted in pregnancy. Sometimes the woman wants to keep the child, and if she's able to leave the employer and reach help, she can. But then you face the issue of, like I said, access to justice, and if she wants to force like the rapist to acknowledge the child or provide child support or these things, it's another system. Then we enter into another complicated system of the personal status code, which is if the father is Lebanese and he decides. So here's the contradiction. If the rapist decides not to take any responsibility, he puts her on a plane and goes back home, or forces her to abort. But if the rapist decides to acknowledge the child, then he can prevent the mother and the child from returning home. We hear so there's like a travel ban on mothers if they want to take the child with them, Lebanese migrants, but this is under the religious court system. So even if they're not married and the rapist acknowledges the child as his own, he can put a travel ban on the mother and the child from leaving the country. We hear this a lot from domestic workers who are live-out domestic workers, and they married or they have Lebanese partners, or are married to a partner under the religious courts. So then it's a totally different system, but you can see like how it also intersects with the vulnerabilities of these women. So yeah, that's about the mothers. Some women, of course, they have children. They are single mothers. Domestic workers, I mean, they continue to live in Lebanon. They might face a problem, like I said, with irregularity. The children would be undocumented. There has been some cases where because the mother is undocumented and she has children who are undocumented, she did not register them, or they are not registered, the woman would be detained with her children and then deported to the country of origin. So
Okay,
that's
so just like in Europe, we detain the children of so-called irregular migrants in detention centers. In Lebanon, the same things happen with mother and children. They are
yeah, there
detained.
was a very there was a case, like I think 3 years back, a Sri Lankan and a Sri Lankan woman and a Sudanese man were married. They had children, but both of them were undocumented or living in, as live-out workers, and their children were not documented. So the General Security detained them and deported them back home. So yes, the children were detained. I think I'm not sure. Sometimes the child might be placed with an organization or at a shelter, or might not. We know that they might be detained with the mother in order to deport them.
Wow. Okay. That's very harsh.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Just to take another step back as well, you mentioned, I mean, here in Europe, during COVID, we had all these images in the news about migrant domestic workers, massive numbers of them being thrown out in the street by their employers. I was wondering if you could, without wanting to take much of your time, but if you could explain to us a little bit what exactly happened during COVID? Why were there so many women on the street? And how is the situation now that the COVID crisis has a bit more stabilized and that's, worldwide, the measures have, lowered a bit? What was the impact of COVID on your work and on the women that you accompany?
So in Lebanon, it was not only COVID, it was the 17th October revolution or uprising, and the economic crisis and the currency inflation that started by the end of 2019 and continues to exist, and the COVID breakout plus the lockdown. So these multiple events and the situation under which domestic workers were living, so they were now trapped with their employers or with the abusive employers specifically over 24/7. Incidents of abuse increased. Remember the currency inflation, and people were laid out of their jobs in this period, so employers lost their jobs and were not paying domestic workers, or employers who were paid by the Lebanese pounds lost the value of their salary. So they started paying the domestic worker in Lebanese pounds, which when transferred to US dollars lose their value, or completely stopped paying the domestic worker. So she was working for free over the period of her employment. So these events, as well as the health concerns, but like the health concern was the least of problems for domestic workers in this situation. So when the employers could not pay anymore, they would fire the domestic worker. But how would they fire her under the system? By dropping her off in the street or kicking her out of the house. And this is why we saw so many workers in the streets. On the other hand, the live-out domestic workers who are undocumented or live alone, they used to have part-time jobs. So they would go to the houses, clean, and go back to their houses, or freelance work, as we call it. But because of the lockdown and the health concerns, employers did not, Lebanese people would not hire them to do work, because they did not want anyone from outside to get to the home in fear of infection and such. So they also lost their jobs. The businesses that hired them, such as restaurants or offices or such, also were closed. So they lost all sorts of income. They were not able to pay rent anymore, and they were evicted. So again, that's why the huge numbers. And what was evident at this situation is how everything works in this country, because it is not designed to function as a country. The institutions of the government are not supposed to work. Like I said, private investors and private sector is supposed to handle this country. In the situation of domestic work, there's no authority to regulate or monitor this work. So it's left for the employer and worker to figure it out when things get messy. Sometimes the agent gets involved, but after the 3-month probation period, there's nothing that the agent is mandated to do. So when the problem was too hard to handle, the employers just got rid of the workers. That's how it happened and why it happened. Because it's a system meant to fail and meant to give power to someone. So when they could not handle it anymore, they just got rid of her.
And now, how has the situation evolved?
Yeah. So because of this, many domestic workers went back home to their countries, and because of the economic crisis, the Lebanese employers or Lebanese people are not as able to hire domestic workers. So many are just not able to recruit domestic workers. Also, there are so many countries that placed a ban on Lebanon, so they would not allow the women to come work here in Lebanon. So there are few countries where women are still recruited. Before it was, for example, Ethiopia, Sri Lanka, Philippines. Now we see a shift in targeting women from Kenya and Sierra Leone as a majority who are being recruited, but also facing the same situation. However, the numbers decreased, they drastically decreased in terms of recruitment of individuals. We see new women entering this marketplace or this kind of work. So they are Lebanese women or Syrian refugee women or Palestinian women who live in the country, and they would work as domestic workers. They don't have to stay in the house. Sometimes they might. However, based on our observations, same violations still happen. So the element of the kafala system is not present, but the violations are still there because these women do not require a residency from the employer. The violations are still the same: not paying, assault or sexual harassment, overworking, same kind of treating the woman with inferiority, because this is not a work or a decent work or whatever. So violations are still the same because domestic workers in this field, or because the country is not regulating this kind of work, the violations are still the same. But yeah, in terms of changes, the migrant women who are arriving to the country are less in numbers, and a huge number of domestic workers left by the end of 2020.
What you just said, it really just breaks down that argument, at least that's what we hear in Europe, that sometimes, domestic workers, they don't want to learn the language, they want to control the system, but this is really not about learning the language or not. It's about an exploitative system existing and being put into place specifically for these purposes. So it's like population or demographics change a bit, but the system itself stays untouched, and things never really change.
Yeah, exactly what you said. So even with unpaid domestic work, because of the patriarchal structure, so beyond the limited scope of the kafala system or of who is doing this work, patriarchy exploits women in domestic work. So that's the basic argument, or it is narrowed down to this: patriarchy exploits women in domestic work because someone needs to do this for free and to be available 24/7 to do it. If it's not the woman, if it's not the mother, it's not a man that is doing it. We get some other woman who is more vulnerable and exploit her in the system. in different systems, not only the kafala system, because like I said, these women who are now working as domestic workers are Lebanese, for example. They don't require any kind of residency. So it all boils down to the exploitation of women to do free work or underpaid work, and to be overworked for extended periods of time, and to keep this division of labor, of what women should do as caretakers and what men do.
Exactly. And this division of labor is really the basis of our patriarchal system. So you put that perfectly. Before I move on to the last question, I wanted to ask you an additional question. Maybe it is a bit odd, but I wanted to know if you think, in your personal opinion or based on what you have observed on the field, that domestic work can be like passed on in an intergenerational way. Because, for example, one of the members of the European Network of Migrant Women is ISALA, is an abolitionist organization that supports women in prostitution. And what we really do there is also, sometimes accompany the daughters, or more generally the children of the prostituted women, so that prostitution isn't intergenerational and we can stop the cycle of abuse. Do you see maybe the same pattern happening with domestic work?
Yeah, we see it in different ways. So with the migrant women specifically, it's usually one sister who came to Lebanon or the Gulf and had whether a good or bad experience. And this is like another side to the story, when the family exploits the woman. So it's like a sister who came to the country and had a successful experience, sent her money to back home, or her family took her money. So the family sends the other sister, and then the other sister, and then so it goes. Because recently, like the Lebanese and the women who reside here in Lebanon are coming back to this work, we do not notice it yet, like if it's intergenerational or such. With some migrants as well, like the older generation, mainly the Sri Lankan women, because they were the first recruited, there are some mother and daughter in the country. So yeah, it is there. It's not the majority of cases, but it is there. What's like I said, the connection is usually that the sister one sister comes, and then they start sending the others and taking their money, or even it might be their decision to come to the country.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, we're reaching the end of our Migrant Women Reality Watch. I would just ask you as the last question, or for a finishing note, if you could share with us what are the main demands of the migrant mothers and the migrant domestic workers that you meet in your work. Like, what exactly do they want, and how do you think their demands can be achieved, even though you work in a setting that doesn't really enable those demands to be met? But I'm sure that there are some positive sides to it. So I was wondering what their main demands are.
So of course it is to abolish the kafala system, and for the kafala system to be abolished, I think the bigger umbrella would be to have a law that regulates domestic work. So what does that mean in practical means? The Article 7 in the labor law needs to be amended so it doesn't exclude domestic workers anymore. So domestic workers have the same provisions as any other workers, and later a law that would have different sections or different regulations for migrants, non-migrants, for part-time workers. So for example, mothers who are domestic workers would be able to take the part-time job, or for live-in and live-out domestic workers. And more importantly, there should be monitoring system. So these women, whether migrants or none, could have a way to file reports, would have an authority to go back to say my wages have not been paid, I need, or this had been committed against me. But yes, the demand is always abolish kafala system and include domestic workers in labor law. And yeah, I think this sums it up, because if these women were already protected under the law, if this work was already regulated by the law, we wouldn't have the sponsorship system that exists at this point in this way. And many violations would by default not exist. So for example, if domestic workers, because under the sponsorship system, just this last remark, domestic workers are supposed to stay in their employer's house, and you could imagine how much abuse is possible when the person is always there, how easily you can overwork them. If a law, for example, allows part-time domestic work or live-out domestic workers, then it would shift the situation or change the situation for domestic workers. But yeah, that's
Thank you so much, Ghina. I wanted to tell our audience, or the people who are with us today, that yesterday KAFA on their Facebook page posted a very nice video with some of the women that they accompany, stating that domestic work is work and that it should be remunerated and treated as such. So I invite everyone to go check that out. I also invite everyone to follow KAFA on social media and to check the report that we were talking about earlier about the perception of sex buyers in Lebanon, which we think as a network, they did a tremendous job on it. And yeah, thank you so much for being with us here today. I know that the internet connection was a bit of an issue on your side, and I'm happy that you took the time and the space to be with us here for this conversation.
Thank you, Adriana. It was a pleasure. I really enjoyed our conversation, and yeah, I'm always following the network's activities and what you guys do, and it's pretty amazing. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. The feeling is mutual towards KAFA. And yes, we keep working together. Have a great night.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.